Recording and see if we can drop back into where we left off. Now, last time when I was gone on Wednesday, we were having you watch the second reproductive system video, which mainly covered the first part of female reproductive system. Okay, so it was kind of finishing up a little bit of male and then getting into female reproductive system. And so I was taking a look at that one, and I think we had gone up to this slide, slide 61. So we were kind of finishing up and doing some of the female reproductive anatomy, and then what we're going to do is we're going to get into the comparative gametogenesis. So remember that with both aspects of the male and female reproductive system, of course we need to know the different organs and what each organ does and the different glands and things like that, like we saw in the male reproductive system. We need to be able to trace things through and link it together in terms of where are the gametes produced, where do they go from there until they exit the system or until potentially they meet their comparative gamete from the other sex. And then we also went through, at least in male so far, we went through and talked about spermatogenesis, or gametogenesis in the male, and how we go through meiosis, starting with one sex cell, a spermatogonium, and then ending up with 4 sperm cells, okay? So that was kind of part of what was in the lecture previously, where that's a continuous process that is occurring throughout the reproductive lifetime of the male. Inside of those seminiferous tubules, we're always having those some spermatogonia, going to primary spermatocytes, going to secondary spermatocytes, going to our spermatids, where they're actually starting to look like sperm rather than just generic cells. And then finally, we have the mature sperm cells in near the lumen of those seminiferous tubules. And those are going to be swept into the epididymis, where they'll finish maturing, where they'll actually get kind of concentrated and activate and things like that, become more active. So we had seen that in the male, and we're going to do that kind of comparative kind of assessment or look at what happens in the female, because there's going to be some similarities. There's still going to be meiosis in terms of 2 different divisions occurring, right? Getting our chromosomes down from 46 down to 23, that's still going to be happening, but in a number of ways, it's also going to be different than what we were seeing before as well in terms of the male. All right. So with that review, hopefully that kind of brings you back a bit in terms of what we were learning last week. Before I move on to new information this week, do you have questions from things you were seeing last week? Awkward silence? Okay, all right. Okay, so finishing up with female reproductive anatomy, we have the external genitalia, right? So this is the information that we are learning in lab as well, where we're seeing that there are going to be folds that are enclosing the clitoris as well as the urethra as well as the vagina, okay? So we have the mons pubis, which is the round fatty area that's overlying the pubic symphysis. So you can see how it has a similar name in terms of pubis and pubic. Then we have the 2 labia, the labia major towards the outside that have hair, as well as the labia minor on the inside, like we mentioned, that are enclosing those 3 structures. Deep to that, we have some different types of glands that are going to be, again, analogous to male. In this case, analogous to the bulbourethral glands. Yeah.
Affected is the mons pubis to weight gain or losing weight?
So that's a good question, right? So we say that it is a fat pad that overlies bone. We know that there's various places where we store fat just for energy, but also for cushion. So remember, like for instance, with the kidneys are only partially protected by the ribs, and they have a fat capsule around them. And so anytime that the body is going through major changes in fat, whether we're increasing or decreasing, that is going to occur both in terms of like subcutaneous fat and belly fat, hip fat and things like that, but also in all of these other places as well. So it's going to deposit it if we have more energy, right? We're gaining energy. It's going to deposit it in all of those places, but also if you're losing weight, it's going to withdraw it from those places as well. So in extreme cases, especially if there's starvation going on or like extreme training or something like that, where people have a really small percentage of body fat, it's definitely going to take it from some of those places as well. So the mons pubis as a pad for over that symphysis pubis in the pubic bones, that can definitely become thinner. We'd also talked, like I said, in the urinary system where those fat capsules that are protecting the kidneys can become so thin that it can cause the kidneys to move as well and become like a little loosened, and they may even drop a bit in people that go through extreme weight loss. Yeah. Okay, so other things, as we mentioned, we just finished up when we were talking in the video, talking about how the clitoris is actually the homologous structure to the penis, that it's erectile tissue as well. And then wrapping up the perineum is the area that encloses a lot of the inferiorly facing external genitalia. So that's the area that we have down there called the perineum. It's kind of diamond shaped instead. All right, so finishing up with the female anatomy, the mammary glands, as we saw in lab, also count as female anatomy that is going to be part of the reproductive system, but again, more towards supporting the baby later on. So as we saw in the lab, we've got mammary glands that are overlying the pectoralis major muscles. So the composition of the breast is going to be not only fat, like we see there, and again, with weight gain or weight loss, that fat is going to wax and wane as well. So that can affect the size of the breast. But the mammary glands themselves are contributing, but they tend to be a bit smaller until they're being called physiologically into play to support the baby. So then the mammary glands themselves, which are always there, are going to then increase in size as they start producing milk. So we have our mammary glands drained by our mammary ducts, which go into lactiferous sinuses. Remember, lactiferous sinuses are these areas where it's a little bit larger diameter, like we see. We get a green color that might be a little bit more obvious. So here, those are going to be the sinuses where our different ducts are going to be draining into, and then we have our lactiferous ducts that end up opening up into the nipple itself. Okay? Now, because we don't know why cancer necessarily crops up or kind of shows up in a number of different organs in the body, but breast cancer seems to be one that is more common than others, and that may have to do with that breast tissue increasing through time with use and things like that, where we have a lot of natural cell division going on, a lot of active tissues. Sometimes those cells get stuck in that cycle of making new cells, like we mentioned cancer often is. So breast cancer can actually show up. It says 70% of women with breast cancer have no known risk factors, even though there are risk factors and there's a lot of active research to try to detect it as early as possible, including hereditary factors. A lot of times it just gets down to that early detection in terms of, like other cancers, detecting lumps, etc. Okay, so breast cancer won't be on the exam itself though. So now we're going to get to oogenesis. So we've done our tour of the different aspects of reproductive anatomy for the female, and now we're going to be talking about oogenesis. So again, some of this is going to be very similar to what we saw in terms of spermatogenesis, but some of it's going to be quite different. As before, I'm going to take us to the image, which tends to be a little bit easier in terms of kind of laying it out and having those visuals, but these slides also go through the content that we're about to talk about. Okay, so this figure is aligning two things. So on the right side, what we're seeing is the development of the follicle that we've seen in the ovary. And this is what we've seen in lab as well, right? When we look at the ovary model, when we're looking at the menstrual model and stuff like that, we learned that the follicle is going to be that oocyte plus the surrounding follicular cells. And when stimulated with follicle-stimulating hormone, right, it's going to develop from a primordial to a primary to a secondary to a mature or a Graafian follicle. And then the largest one, like we said, that mature or Graafian or tertiary follicle is going to be the one that is going to release the egg during ovulation. So we're kind of seeing that on the right-hand side. We're seeing the development of the follicle, and we're going to put that together with development of the oocyte inside of it as well. Okay? Yeah.
Does the point at where it is an oocyte with an oophorus? That is
like
that,
a cumulus oophorus?
Yeah, the cumulus oophorus. Is that only when it's a mature cell?
So that is when it's a mature follicle. Yeah. And when it gets released here during ovulation, it's going to still retain some of that cumulus oophorus as well as the corona radiata, etc. Now that's also the case when we have a secondary follicle. So the secondary follicle, the definition of the secondary follicle is when we have that fluid-filled antrum. So once we have that presence of the fluid-filled antrum, now we're going to have follicular cells near the oocyte that are going to have different names like the cumulus oophorus and corona radiata and stuff like that. And then we're going to have follicular cells that are around the edge of the follicle, which is not much bigger, which is going to be, right, so those two layers of cells, the flattened layers of cells, right? So those, like the granulosa cells and things like that, are going to be around the periphery. So you have to get to that secondary follicle first, then you'll start seeing those different types of follicular cells that we know names for.
Okay.
And some of those, like we said, that are nearest to the oocyte, even when it's ovulated, will still be attached to it. And that's what the sperm cell is having to kind of fight through when fertilization is occurring. Okay, so again, on the right side here, we're seeing the development of the follicle. And on the left side here, we're seeing the meiotic events. We're basically seeing oogenesis in terms of what's going on with the oocyte itself. Now, do notice that we're seeing a timeline here as well. So right here in green is where childhood is. Right here is before you're born. So early in the fetal stage is when these cells are going to be created. Okay? So remember, that's a difference. So with the spermatocytes, we are not producing mature sperm cells until puberty. And then it's kind of a continuous process of cranking out millions upon billions of those cells. With the female reproductive system, every egg that you will ever release, you created before you were born, in the fetal stages. And then they're stored in the ovary, and at certain times, using hormones, will be stimulated to develop further inside of a follicle and then be released on a monthly schedule throughout your reproductive lifetime. Okay? So when we see this up at the top up here, we know that in the oocyte, we're going to see those primordial follicles. There's going to be primordial follicles. We saw them in the microscope. We saw them in the models and stuff like that. We're only going to have primordial follicles, and those are going to be all of your oocytes with their surrounding cells that are stored in the ovary itself. So when in the embryonic stage, or in the fetal stage, you created those, what we had inside of each one of those follicles is we started with the oogonium, and look at the name, right? Oogonium is just like spermatogonium. That's the stem cell, the sex stem cell, that creates the gametes, okay? So we started out with the oogonium, and through mitotic events, it made more oogonia so that we could make more of these gametes. And then from the oogonium, we go to a primary oocyte. So the primary oocyte is now where we have a cell that is starting meiosis. Now remember, with meiosis, there's going to be 2 rounds of division, ending up with haploid cells that have half of the genetic material. But it takes 2 rounds to do that. So what they're doing is, before they start into meiosis, they duplicate all of their DNA. Because ultimately, right, we need those cells to have copies of the DNA. So if we were just doing mitosis, we would do 1 cell division. We'd have 2 cells. Each one would have a full complement of DNA. They would both be diploid cells. They'd both have 46 chromosomes. But we do that division twice. So those 2 cells then divide again. So each of the 4 cells, like we saw in spermatogenesis, have half of the genetic material. They have 23 chromosomes each. Okay? So we do this duplication of the chromosomes. So now we have basically, for a short period of time, we have 92, right? We duplicated all the chromosomes. We divide, now we have 2 with 46. We divide those 2, now we have 4 with 23. That's what we saw with spermatogenesis. So at this point, we have done a duplication event. We've copied the DNA. And then we actually stop, in terms of oogenesis, at prophase 1. Okay? So prophase 1, remember prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. Prophase is when we're winding up the DNA that we've copied. because we're going to start moving it around. And we don't want it all diffuse as chromatin. We want it nice and coiled up as chromosomes. So we basically kind of duplicate the DNA. We wind it up so we're ready to go when we need to divide. And then for the female reproductive system, it stops right there. So all of your primordial follicles are stuck at prophase 1. Okay? So that's what we're seeing in terms of the oocyte inside of those primordial follicles. They're sitting there in prophase 1, and they've kind of frozen that way until later on, under the stimulation of follicle stimulating hormone, a handful of them on a monthly basis will get stimulated to continue development. Okay? So that's where we're going to pick up that we see down at the bottom here. So here's our primordial follicle. We're going to stimulate it. It's going to change into a primary follicle, right? The oocyte gets bigger. The follicular cells along the edge start to get more pronounced, more cuboidal and things like that. And at this point, even when we've gotten to a primary follicle, the oocyte inside is still sitting at prophase 1. Okay, so now we go from primary to secondary to mature follicle, and this is where our oocyte is now going to continue its division. So what we see here is that when we get to that secondary follicle, when we have the fluid-filled antrum and stuff like that, now we've kick-started that meiosis again. And so now we go into metaphase 1 and anaphase 1 and telophase 1, right? Where we're separating things out. And so at that point, what happens is we produce one oocyte, one mature egg cell, and then, look at this. The other thing that we produce at the end of meiosis 1 is not another viable cell like we saw with spermatogenesis, but we produce this thing that's called a polar body. So the polar body, see how it says N in it? Remember that represents a single copy of DNA? So it's got a single copy of DNA in it, and what we're doing with that division is we're getting rid of an excess copy of DNA, right? We have to get down to haploid cells. So we're definitely doing that still, but that polar body that you see on the left-hand side there, really small, and it's not ever going to become a functional cell. Because the oocyte itself needs to be much bigger, it's basically going to be the housing for that zygote later on. The sperm cell's super small, like we saw, right? It gets smaller and smaller and more hydrodynamic, right, in terms of its shape. And it's basically 23 chromosomes packed into the head, a motor in the mid-piece, and then a flagellum to get those 23 chromosomes to where they need to go. That's it. It's streamlined, right? So when it actually fertilizes the egg is actually going to produce or have lots of cytosol, lots of all of the different organelles and things like that early zygote is going to need. So because it needs so much more of those cellular structures, we need the division, this first meiotic division, a lot of that material, cellular material, gets dumped into the oocyte itself, and we just get rid of a little bit of those chromosomes in the polar body itself. So we keep this cell really big. It's one of the biggest cells in the body. And so after our meiosis 1 division, we produce a mature oocyte, which is called the secondary oocyte, graduated from primary, and a polar body. So after the first meiotic division, which occurs in that mature follicle that we see there, we actually have one secondary oocyte and then a polar body. So at that point, that secondary oocyte that's been released during ovulation, it's been released from the follicle, that still has made it into now meiosis 2, but it's basically stopped in the middle of meiosis 2. And that second meiotic division will only complete if that oocyte, that secondary oocyte, actually gets penetrated by a sperm cell. So it will only continue to complete its second meiotic division if fertilization occurs. Okay? So you can see right here in this diagram, there's a sperm cell that is fertilizing the egg, and at that point, the entry of the head of the sperm cell will stimulate that cell to do and complete its second meiotic division. At which point it produces a second polar body, again getting rid of a copy of that DNA so that this cell, this mature oocyte or ovum, has 23 chromosomes there of its own to combine with the 23 chromosomes from the head of the sperm cell. So meiosis II in the female reproductive system only completes if fertilization occurs. So this process, in terms of the meiotic divisions, in terms of oogenesis, in the female, it can take decades, right? So think about it, because that first cell, the oogonium, was created before you were born. It then took at least, 10 plus years until you reached reproductive maturity, right? So there's at least a decade there. And then, for all of those primordial follicles that are sitting in the ovary, there are a number of those follicles with their oocytes sitting inside that may not get stimulated to release until what? Like you're 40 years old or something like that. So in terms of completing oogenesis, this process in a female could take like 50 years. From the time the egg was created originally until it completes meiosis in the meiotic division and makes that secondary oocyte turn into our ovum, etc. So in the male, that process, like we were talking about, going through all those different steps, is continuous through the reproductive lifetime of the male and takes on the order of months in terms of going through, maybe a couple of months in terms of creating all those different stages. This is on the order of decades, right? So again, similarities and differences. So we're still going through 2 rounds of meiosis. We're still getting down to a haploid cell that only has 23 chromosomes. But in the male, we start out with 1 spermatogonium that ends up with 4 mature gametes. And in the female, we start out with 1 oogonium, and we only get 1 ovum at the end of this process, right? But that's okay, because in the female reproductive system, we're only releasing 1 of these eggs per month. And so over the reproductive lifetime of the female, if you're talking like, let's round it off, from 10 years old to 50 years old, let's say, that's 40 years, times 12 months, 1 a month on average. So that's maybe 500 gametes that are released from the female over the reproductive lifetime. That's it. As opposed to, remember, in 1 ejaculation, you're talking like 500 million gametes, right? Totally different reproductive strategy, right? So we're putting in a lot of effort into this 1 cell that we're holding internally until it gets released from the ovary, and now it's starting its migration. So that is oogenesis, okay? The production of the egg. So still meiosis, but quite a bit different in terms of what we were seeing in terms of the male reproductive system. Okay, so that is definitely an exam objective, talking about gametogenesis between male and female and kind of comparing them in different ways. So make sure you take a look at that. All right, so the other things I want to get into today, to at least get down like a first layer of, was talking about the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle. Because we had been mentioning, that was one of the reasons that we did male reproductive system first and then female reproductive system, is that it's a bit more complex because we have these 2 different internal female reproductive organs that go through cycles, monthly cycles, that have to be coordinated with one another. So we want to talk a little bit about that today, just to kind of layer it on, and then we'll review it again next time. Okay, so with the ovarian cycle. There are 3 phases of the ovarian cycle. There is the follicular phase, there is ovulation, which is actually in the middle of the cycle, so maybe we could call that day 14, or it isn't always, to be sure, but that would be the middle of the cycle, and then the 3rd phase is called the luteal phase. So there's 3 phases of the ovarian cycle. So let's get to an image here as well, where we can kind of see what's going on. Now this is similar to our ovary model that we saw in lab. And we know that there's a process going on there, kind of a timeline that's going on there, as we had just talked about. So these are follicles, remember? And so we have primordial and primary and secondary, where we see that fluid-filled antrum showing up, right? So we can see it there. And then a mature follicle that's going to release the egg. So all of this that we see occurring over on this side, where the follicles are developing, That's occurring during basically the first 2 weeks of that 28-day on average cycle. Okay? That's the follicular phase, because what's going on there? The follicles are developing, right? So the follicles are going from primordial, a handful of them, from primordial to primary to secondary to mature. So in the first couple of weeks of that cycle is called the follicular phase because the follicles are developing. And they're developing because we have follicle stimulating hormone coming down from, where does follicle stimulating hormone come from? Yeah, anterior pituitary, exactly. So follicle stimulating hormones coming down from the anterior pituitary and stimulating a handful of those follicles to start developing into the follicular phase, right? So we've got the first half of the cycle that is that. The second stage of our cycle is going to be ovulation. Now this stage itself is very quick, right? It just consists of the egg bursting forth from the surface, the cortex of the ovary. So it's released from it. So that's like not even a day. It's basically like a minute or something like that, or even instantaneous, right? As soon as it pops out, that's ovulation. So that's our second phase. And then the third phase of the ovarian cycle is what we see happening kind of over on the left-hand side instead. And that, ooh, I'm way up there. And that over here is going to be the luteal phase. Because remember that our corpus hemorrhagicum, which is basically this, which has those surrounding follicular cells, is now going to transform into our yellow body, the corpus luteum that we see there, right? And the corpus luteum has a job to do. It starts releasing hormones to communicate to the uterus, letting the uterus know that the egg is on its way, that the ovaries release the egg. The uterus better prepare for its arrival because it's going to be having guests soon, right? So it's got to put out the fancy towels and change the sheets and all that type of thing, right? Change the lining because something might be embedding there, might be actually sleeping there, right? Okay, so that's the corpus luteum. And then ultimately that corpus luteum can also turn into our corpus albicans if pregnancy doesn't occur. That's the white body that we see on the left there. So that's the third phase that we have over here. It's called the luteal phase because the corpus luteum is coming into being during that phase. After the egg is ovulated, the corpus luteum is formed. So that's our third phase of the ovarian cycle. Yeah?
So if the egg is fertilized,
yeah,
it will stimulate, like it'll keep the luteum from becoming an albicans, right?
Yeah.
And what happens to it? Like
what happens to what? The corpus luteum ultimately?
Yeah.
So ultimately, it will basically stay around for a number of months in order to keep releasing those hormones, in order to maintain the uterine lining, in order to maintain that endometrium, which is where our zygote has embedded, right? Our early embryo has embedded. So it'll stay around for a number of months until the placenta forms, and then the placenta kind of takes over in terms of not only exchanging gases and nutrients and stuff like that and fluids, but also it releases hormones of its own to maintain pregnancy. So that corpus luteum will stay around for a number of months, but ultimately it also will regress and become that corpus albicans as well. Now, if it's a regular monthly cycle and no pregnancy occurs, then it's going to very quickly go from the corpus luteum to the corpus albicans in like 10 days or something like that. But if pregnancy occurs, then it's going to stretch out for a number of months instead.
So if fertilization happens, then the yellow guy will stimulate or will release hormones. If it's not fertilized, it just doesn't release anything.
So yeah, we're going to get to that coming up as we will talk about development, right? Because that's the second reason that we're doing female reproductive system after male, is because it's going to transition very well into talking about pregnancy and that whole feedback loop in terms of what happens. So there will be hormonal feedback when pregnancy occurs that in essence lets these ovaries know that yes, pregnancy has occurred, so keep that corpus luteum around, keep releasing that progesterone, etc., to help maintain that endometrium. Yeah. So there is a feedback mechanism. And if pregnancy doesn't occur, then that chemical feedback won't get to the system. And so then basically, we're listening to see if pregnancy occurred. with receptors, etc. And if there's no message, then we go into turning this cycle around again, developing more follicles again, and the uterus then goes into menstruation that we'll talk about and resets for the potential for next month. John?
So the corpus luteum, the hormone that it releases, is not progesterone?
It is progesterone.
Okay.
Yeah. I just wasn't, and then a little bit of estrogen as well.
Okay.
I just wasn't kind of throwing in that detail yet. But it's
Okay.
true. Yeah, that's the one. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I'm kind of confused. I don't know if you can answer this.
Yeah.
Like, you probably can.
I hope so.
But like on your period, you bleed out like your lining.
Yeah,
But, like,
the
don't you-
endometrium.
Don't you bleed out like the egg that isn't fertilized too?
So that's a good
so
point.
that's why I'm confused why there's like cells after that, like the luteum and albicans. I don't know. I just don't understand how that turns into that, I guess.
Right. So when that egg gets released, and we're coming up to that, when that egg gets released, where is it going to go? It gets released from the ovary. What's the structure surrounding the ovary that kind of looks like fingers? Right, the fimbriae. So those, as a catcher's glove, are going to catch the egg. And then it's going to start transporting down the uterine tube, right? And it's usually in this area, in my forearm, where pregnancy occurs. Okay, so we'll talk about that later on. So that's where pregnancy occurs, and then, fertilization occurs, and then it's going to continue migrating down. It's going to be doing divisions, like we talked about, 2-cell stage, 4-cell, 8-cell, 16-cell, morula, all of that, while it's migrating down to the uterus, right? And it's within the uterine wall where it's going to embed. And then we're going to see some chemical feedback, etc. Now that is if pregnancy occurs. But regardless of whether fertilization occurs and then pregnancy occurs, that egg is still moving down those uterine tubes, right? So you're right. If no fertilization occurs, during menstruation, not only are we going to be losing most of that endometrium, but that egg is going to be in there somewhere as well. And that's going to come out during that period. Yeah.
I get that. I just don't understand why there's
So these are the surrounding follicular cells that we saw here.
Uh-huh.
And those are not released during ovulation. Only the oocyte itself, with some of those surrounding cells.
Okay,
only
so
that is released, and all of these remain. That's what we're seeing here.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then that's what becomes the
and
corpus
so those don't have
luteum.
the cell in the middle. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
That makes way more sense.
Yeah.
I didn't catch on to that in the beginning.
That's good. Yeah. Okay, so like we mentioned, ovulation is going to be that middle stage, the fastest of those 3 ovarian stages, and that's when our secondary oocyte is going to be released. Interestingly enough, like we mentioned, it bursts forth from the surface of the ovary. Interestingly enough, there are some women who can actually feel that. So Mittelschmerz, I don't know, Bob Mittelschmerz, like some German guy or something, I would assume, right? It was named for, I'm sure, the scientists that discovered it. You would hope it was for the women that he was studying, but probably not. So Mittelschmerz is actually being able to feel when the ovary is releasing that egg, that oocyte, from the surface of it. So, to a certain extent, while it may be uncomfortable, and I have had former students say, yeah, that happens to me, right? It'd be very convenient in terms of, right, if you didn't want to be pregnant, or if you did want to be pregnant, everybody's interested when that ovulation is happening, and you actually have a good indication about when that's happening. And it can be sensitive enough that they can be like, oh, yep, it was the left side this month. Oh, it was the right side that month.
Okay,
Yeah.
question. So I have that, but only on my right side. Only my right side.
Oh,
Not my
interesting. Okay.
And Harley
Yeah,
too.
you can tell which side you're ovulating from.
Right.
I can't.
Right.
Only
If you
when
have
it's the
that,
right side.
if you're actually getting that pain from it. So it could be, I don't know, right? So it could be, we know that most of our organs have a connective tissue capsule to them. Now on the ovary, it has to be a little bit thinner because the eggs actually have to erupt from it. But maybe on the one side, the capsule of the surrounding connective tissue is a little bit thicker, so it's more of a process to get it out, which may cause that pain. And it may be a little bit thinner on the other side, which is a little bit easier to get through. It's kind of like, like the rind in an orange or something like that, right? A thicker one, thinner one, it's easier or harder to get through, maybe. So you got like half your information, like so from your experience, like how often is that one ovary releasing? Is it about half the time?
Well, so like that, I guess for me, it was just more annoying than me, like, paying attention to it. Like,
Yeah.
I paid attention to other things, like
Sure.
cervical position, cervical fluid,
Yeah.
basal body temperature, all that stuff. So
Yeah.
that was like, I don't know. I just was like, oh, that didn't feel good.
Mine takes
That was
Okay.
annoying.
What's that?
Each month, it's like the other side.
So yours actually alternates very regularly.
Yeah, very regular.
Interesting. So that's one of the things too you're wondering about, right? We have these hormones that go down that stimulate these other glands, right? Follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone that we're going to be talking about soon. How is, right, the cells have to have the receptors to get those signals we know. How is it that one side picks up that signal more than the other side? What I can only hypothesize is that, you know, when we talked about downregulation and upregulation, where the cells, the receptive cells, can kind of pull in their receptors and not listen to the signal or put out a lot of receptors. My guess is that maybe on a monthly basis, one of those ovaries will really be more sensitive with more of the receptors to pick up the signal, and the other one will be less sensitive. So maybe that upregulation and downregulation comes into play in terms of which ovary is going to get that signal on a monthly basis.
Can you lose more than one egg on a period?
Yeah, definitely so. So on average it's one, but it can be more than one. So that's where you can get fraternal twins,
Yeah.
right?
That's what I was thinking. I was like,
Yeah, exactly. So that's what we're seeing down here, right? So 1 to 2% of ovulations release more than one secondary oocyte. So on average it's one, and as we saw, it can be alternating like that, but everybody's a little bit different. Okay, so like we mentioned, the third phase of the ovarian cycle, we have the follicular phase where the follicles are developing, we have ovulation, and then we have the luteal phase. So the luteal phase is where that corpus luteum is going to form, and it is going to be releasing progesterone mainly, as well as some estrogen. And those are the hormones that are going to communicate down to the uterus and let the uterus know what's going on in terms of that the egg has been released. So these are the hormones, as we were talking about, that are going to be involved. We have follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. These are two gonadotropins, and remember, a tropic hormone is going down to another endocrine gland and telling it what to do in terms of hormonal release. And gonadotropin, right, is saying that it's going down to the gonads. So follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone both go down to the ovary and tell it what to do. Follicle-stimulating hormone is controlling the development of the follicles, pretty straightforward name. Luteinizing hormone kind of has a dual role. Okay? There's a big spike in luteinizing hormone that actually causes ovulation, and then a continued kind of high level is maintained in order to cause that corpus luteum to be formed. So with those hormones, and we can see, hold on, this is actually doing the same thing. We can see that here as well. So here is our pituitary gland, and what we're seeing is that the follicle-stimulating hormone is the main hormone that is causing the follicular phase, which is what we see through here. But ovulation, this stage right there, is caused by a big spike in luteinizing hormone. So that causes our ovulation, and then a higher level, maintained higher level, actually causes the luteal phase, which is where our corpus luteum is going to be formed as well. So those are the two hormones, right? So we have two hormones that are controlling three phases. Follicle-stimulating hormone is doing the first phase. Luteinizing hormone is doing the last two phases. Okay? All right. The last thing that I want to touch on, just to introduce it, is that those are ovarian phases, right? Those are the three phases that are going on in the ovary, but down in the uterus, we're going to have three phases as well. And these three phases, and it's a cycle, it goes around, so kind of which one you call the first phase is kind of up to you, but the menstrual phase is generally considered the first phase where everything is resetting. So there's menstruation, then there's the proliferative phase, and then there's the secretory phase. And with these, we're actually familiar with these because we saw these in the microscope as well, right? We didn't see the menstrual phase per se, but we did see the proliferative phase and the secretory phase. Because when we saw that in the slide, we looked at the endometrium, and we saw the myometrium underneath, all smooth muscle down here, and in the endometrium, we saw those uterine glands. And during the proliferative phase, that endometrium has built back, right? It's proliferated. All the cells have proliferated. We've grown that endometrium back. We've grown blood vessels back into it, and those uterine glands are growing into it. But then in the secretory phase, we are continuing to enrich that endometrium that we've grown back. So those uterine glands become spiraled like this, and therefore in the microscope they have very wavy borders to them. So that was the way that we could tell the difference between the proliferative phase and the secretory phase. We're looking at the border of those uterine glands. And if they had a wavy border, we were looking at the secretory phase, where they're doing a lot of secretion to support the potential embedding embryo. Yeah?
Are there other hormones that are involved with the whole menstrual cycle? Like, so PMS, that week before your period when you feel crazy.
Yeah?
Like, why? Does estrogen affect you, like your nervous system? Is it another hormone?
Tell us now.
Yeah, there's definitely a variety of hormones that work together, like synergistic, yeah?
If I'm not tracking it, but there's a moment that I'm like, I really want to go off on this person. I'm like, ooh, you know what, let me see. Oh,
Yeah.
okay, my period's in 5 days. I will not have this conversation for another week at least. So, like, it very much affects me mentally.
Emotionally,
Yeah.
as well. Yeah.
So why?
Now, why? That's a good question. So we know that a number of hormones, right, can affect all kinds of different organs around the body. There may be some primary ones. So like when you guys are going through right now and you're making flashcards and saying, what are the target organs? There are some that are very clear, like this is what it's mainly doing. But there's a variety of other systems and cells around the body that can respond as well. So, growth hormone, like all over the place, thyroid hormone, all over the place. The sex hormones also have effects all over the place as well in terms of growth and metabolism, both in males and females. Remember we talked about testosterone and, people that enhance their use of testosterone because it has these metabolic effects. So the same thing happens in terms of the female sex hormones as well. There's going to be differences in terms of things like cortisol levels as well, antidiuretic hormone, or aldosterone, because we're coming into a potential stage where our fluid levels are going to need to be bolstered a bit, right? Because whether you're going to menstruation and you're going to be losing tissues and fluid that you need to replace, or whether you're going to pregnancy and you're going to need to be creating amniotic fluid and all of these embryonic tissues and all their fluids and stuff like that, we're going to need to ramp up for that. So we're going to see a lot of those hormones that are going to also have monthly cycles in females to prepare for that, whichever way that's going to go. Now, in terms of emotional, that's a good question. I don't know.
Well, so if you have like a genetic male that is transitioning and they give that person estrogen,
yeah,
does that make them feel crazy? Like, do they know what hormone makes you feel emotional?
Like
I-
roid rage with higher levels of testosterone.
Right, that happens, right? So we know that's a good point, right? There's an emotional aspect to sex hormones in males as well. So spikes, well, we're going to see this coming up. I'm not going to hit it today because I'm trying to, again, give you guys a little bit of extra time, not overload your brains with things before the lab practical, but at least the things we're doing today are the same things that we're talking about in the lab practical, right? A lot of the structures, reproductive structures and things like that, and stages, etc. So I could see where you could have those emotional effects from increases. We definitely have increases in spikes of these sex hormones as well as some of these other trophic hormones at certain points of the cycle. And so, like, what's the function of the emotion, the emotional change? It could be kind of just a secondary effect that it happens, but there also could be some sort of functional significance to it as well, right? It's quite possible. I don't know, we know that even some of these sex hormones can affect sex drive and libido. So at certain spikes of testosterone, whether it's coming from the adrenal glands, whether it's coming from the testes in the males or whatever, that can affect that. So it potentially could increase the possibility that the male and female are going to get together and these gametes are going to potentially meet for fertilization. But there also could be the opposite side as well, right? So basically, pregnancy didn't occur, and so now the woman's body needs to prepare for, okay, menstruation is going to happen. That's a big stress on the body, like we said. We're going to be losing fluids and tissues, etc. So maybe there's an aspect of that where it's like, no, I need to focus on myself for a while because I'm going to be going through this physiological stress, and so maybe that helps to kind of keep people away. And like whatever you're doing, you need to deal with that now because I have to deal with a lot of internal issues to get back to, you know, creating that lining and all that. I don't know, but could be. Yeah, I can see it. Okay, so these are our 3 phases of the uterine cycle, and so what we'll do is I'll taper off there, just mentioning those 3 phases of the uterine cycle, and we'll kind of bring it all together in terms of the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle next time. We'll talk about these hormones. We can see the hormones that we were talking about, the gonadotrophic hormones, the luteinizing and the follicle-stimulating, and then we'll bring in our estrogens and progesterone like we were just talking about, and how those affect these cycles as well. Okay? All right, so I'll pick up there next time, and we'll finish up. We'll have time to answer questions next time as well. So come with your questions. And then as I mentioned today for the lab practical, we'll start at 10. Okay, so you got a little bit more than an hour right now. I kind of wish that they had their free coffee and donuts for you now while you're getting ready for the practical, but after the practical, they will have those up in the student life office. Okay? So go through your study materials, go through your practice lab practicals online, and we'll see you in a short bit.